All right. Welcome back to the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast, guys. I am super excited today because we have someone who I have looked up to in this industry for a very long time now. Typically, we tend to have, two types of people. One type of person knows a lot about a very small niche of things, and the other type of person knows a little bit about a lot of different things. But this guy knows a lot about a lot of things, especially in health and fitness. So, introducing here, Greg Nuckols. Super excited to have you on. So, if you would just introduce yourself to our audience. I don't know how many of them might be familiar with you already, but just kind of what you do, how you got to this point in your career, and who you are.
Sure. So my name is Greg. I am a powerlifter and coach and blogger. Um, how I got to this point in my career, that's pretty wide open, I guess. Let's see. So I started what eventually became my business in undergrad. My then girlfriend, now wife, was my training partner, and I would talk her ear off about lifting all the time. And she said, "Hey, why don't you start a blog so you can find some people who are as obsessed about this stuff as you are?" Um, so I ended up starting my business just because I annoyed my girlfriend. Um, and yeah, people started reading, and then she got a really prestigious internship in California after we graduated from college. I had a job lined up back in North Carolina, working in the gym. Couldn't really swing that commute, and so we went out to California. I got a job as content manager for Juggernaut, Chad Wesley Smith's company, and I mean, SoCal's really expensive, and the work with Juggernaut was pretty much part time. So finances were fairly tight, and looked at site traffic and realized that this little blog that I never intended to be a business probably had enough readership to try to make a business. Um, and so yeah, we gave it a crack and haven't really looked back.
Yeah, so if you guys are listening to this, Greg has a podcast of his own. Actually, well, you're the temporary guest host of the Stronger by Science podcast with Eric Trexler. But that is another super popular podcast in kind of this niche in the evidence-based fitness space. So definitely give that one a listen. But yeah, finding Stronger by Science was, to be honest, one of the more pivotal moments in my decision to pursue a master's degree in exercise science, and just kind of learning more about the process of research itself, and like the just empirical method, and learning about how we actually come to these conclusions of, how we make progress, how we change our diets, and how we train.
Well,
And
that's very gratifying to hear. Are you currently a master's student?
yes, I am about to start my second semester, and it's a 2-year program.
Very nice. Where are you at?
George Mason in Northern Virginia.
Sweet.
Yeah. So not too far, like 6 hours down to where you guys are.
Yeah, thereabouts. Are you getting ideas for thesis topics lined up yet?
Yes, and I think so. We were just discussing off air. Greg was like, "Hey, I feel like we've met before, but I don't think we have. This might have been where you recognize my name from. We emailed back and forth a couple of times about hormonal contraceptives and
Oh,
exercise performance. So that is my research interest, and I'm looking at the progestin-only types of contraceptives and how they might impact performance.
That is really cool because I mean, I'm sure this isn't new information to you. There's so little research on that. It's all combined contraceptives.
Yeah. And so your paper in one of the more recent issues of Mass was like, I read that and I was like, wow, thank you so much for like adding to this. And I wish I had it for my first semester, because the entire fall semester was completely centered around writing a literature review.
Mm-hmm.
So I read your article in Mass right after I had finished submitting that paper, and I was like, wow, I really wish I could have had this too, just for like a couple of extra papers that I like let slip through the cracks.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I think that might have been it, because we emailed, I think it was the summer prior, back and forth a little bit about the topic, because I had some
Okay, yeah,
questions.
that would definitely make sense.
Yeah, so it's definitely like a name recognition thing there.
Cool.
But yeah, your podcast has been super informative and pivotal in my own journey to pursue this further. So thank you for that. But before we get too much into that other topic, I wanted to just, Christina, why don't you frame the conversation and talk about what we're actually going to get into today?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about how you would start a program or how you would maybe begin a healthy lifestyle. And sometimes the question that often comes up is, how fast should I see results, or like how many gains should I expect? And so that's kind of the topic for today, because our podcast, we like to talk about research and science, but also give our audience a like healthy takeaways. So that's what we want to get into today.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
And kind of looking at, okay, so when we start a program, asking ourselves, what should we expect? But, why should I expect this? What makes me different from the next person running the same program? And why are we seeing different results? So kind of the overarching theme of today is going to be talking about variation in training responses, which Greg has written a number of articles about and talks about at length on his podcast as well. So we're going to kind of dip our toes into a bunch of different reasons why this might be. So to kind of intro us into this, we see a ton of variation in responses to training and nutrition interventions, both in research and with coaching. I'll have some clients who start a fat loss phase, and all of a sudden I have their calories up at 3,000 and they're just losing weight and we don't know why. And, and it's like this miracle of this person just responded crazy out of the blue, and they're able to just eat all the macros and do all the training and be great. And then we have on the other end of the spectrum a client who might start something similar and might need to dig really, really deep with their diet in order to see results, or might not be able to handle a bunch of training volume without seeing injuries or aches and pains creep up. And so there's a ton of individual variation in response to any kind of protocol that you're going to give someone or that you're going to start yourself listening to this. And so when we talk in the research context, we're comparing group means to group means. And so what that means is, you have an experimental group of a bunch of people, and that you're comparing that against a control group. And so when you run an intervention, you are comparing the average result of one group to the average result of another. And so when you hear in a study like this approach was superior to this other approach, or this approach had no difference to another, that's based on the group mean. But it's important to realize that within these studies there are people that are hyper responding and there are people that aren't responding quite as well, and that's averaging out. And so there's always going to be a variation even in those studies. So just kind of framing the conversation in that way, we want to make sure that we're touching on people's expectations. Typically, if you start something, you will probably fall somewhere close to that average, but not always. Greg, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's definitely the high points. I think the only place I can really add value here is just to kind of put some numbers on those things. So, I think probably the best place to look at in the research, just to quantify the sheer variation in training responses we see, is there was a really, really large study by Hubal and colleagues, Monica Hubal, back in 2005. It had, if memory serves, 585 subjects. So, huge study, huge sample to be able to see and quantify how large training responses differ. Had people train bicep curls for, I believe, 6 months, if memory serves. Trained twice per week, pretty straightforward program. I think it was just 3 sets to failure twice a week. And they looked at changes in strength and changes in biceps cross-sectional area. And the strength gains, I think everyone made some gains, but we're talking like a difference from very, very minimal. So, like probably going up one weight increment, maybe like 20 to 25 pounds or something like that. Like 20 pounds to 25 pounds versus the top responders more than doubled their bicep curl strength over the course of the program. And then for hypertrophy, the lowest responders actually slightly decreased bicep size after 6 months of training. And to be clear, that was like 4 people out of a sample of nearly 600. So that's a very, very uncommon response. But then the top responder had an increase in cross-sectional area of 59%. So, increasing bicep size by more than 50% after just 6 months of training. The average in that study was, I think, an increase in cross-sectional area of like 22% thereabouts. So, we're not talking about looking for the outlieriest of the outliers, like, pro athletes who are 1 in a million. Like, we're talking 1 in 600 people getting gains about 3 times better than average. So just to put some numbers on that and quantify like the sheer amount of variation we see. Let's see. So that's like, it's not really an anecdote. That's the findings of one study. But not earlier this year, earlier last year now, it's 2021. So last year I was working on a data project. Some friends and I came across some research that we thought might be kind of sketchy, and we wanted to be able to quantify how sketchy it was. And one of the things that seemed kind of weird about it is that the gains, all of the strength gains reported in a group of studies were remarkably homogeneous. So instead of seeing a fair amount of variation, people got very, very consistent results. So, for example, if you saw a increase in leg press strength on average of 20 kilos, maybe the worst person put on 16 kilos and the best person put on 26. So like pretty tight range there. And we thought that seemed remarkably homogeneous, but we wanted to be able to quantify how remarkably homogeneous it was. And so we put together a database of I think it was 89 studies that reported changes in strength and also variations in changes in strength. And we found that the typical coefficient of variation, which you don't need to know what that is, but basically the change in mean was, or like the change in average strength was about 1.6 times larger than the standard deviation. So for example, oh man, dividing by 1.6 in your head while you're trying to talk is difficult. But okay, so basically if on average you're seeing an increase in strength of 10 kilos in a particular study, say, that would mean that you'd expect to see a standard deviation of 6 to 7 kilos. And so a standard deviation, that's not telling you the entire range of the data. That's telling you what a very, very typical response would be. So if you're seeing an average increase of 10, that means that, not dealing with the outliers, just a very, very normal response. You should expect to see 3 to 4 kilo increases on the bottom end, up to 16, 17 kilo increases kind of on the top end of that very, very typical range, which would be like a 5-fold difference in responses. And then if you go 2 standard deviations out, now you're dealing with about 95% of the responses you'd expect to see. And so now you're dipping into the negative territory for poor responses, losses of 2, 3, 4 kilos, up to gains of 23, 24 kilos on the top end. So just within 2 standard deviations, you should expect to see people getting responses that are twice as good as average. And again, those aren't outliers. That's 2 standard deviations is pretty normal responses. That's 95% of what you'd expect to see. And 95% sounds like a big number, but you should expect 1 in 20 to either get meaningfully better or meaningfully worse results than that. So That's not outlier stuff at all. And so, yeah, across, again, like a pretty hefty body of literature, about 89 studies, that was the typical amount of variation that we saw in the literature.
So how did that one homogeneous study like compare to those 89 in terms of like the degree to which it was so homogeneous?
So across the group of studies we were looking at, the changes in means were about it's like 6 to 7 times larger than the changes in standard deviation. So instead of like 1.6 times larger, which was a pretty enormous difference.
Wow. So do you think with that study that something was conducted wrong, or what are your thoughts on that?
So we published a white paper going through the findings. That was just one of the somewhat odd things we found in that group of studies. There were about a dozen of them. So I don't know. This probably isn't the time or place to litigate that, but there were some really, really weird things in those studies. I think, this probably isn't the right place to get into that. But if you just Google Barbell white paper, BARBALHO white paper, it should come up. There's weird stuff. You can read it and decide for yourself.
Sounds good. I think that's an important point that you bring up though, with talking about standard deviations and a normal bell curve. So if someone here who hasn't listened to or hasn't learned statistics or taken a basic statistics course, basically everyone is going to fall under a bell curve shape. So it's going to, across the x-axis, start low, climb up, hit a peak, and then symmetrically or somewhat symmetrically come down and get low again across your variation of response. And so when Greg's talking about 95% of people are going to fall within 2 standard deviations, I think it's so important to acknowledge, like, even in just that one example of that one study, we're talking about a difference between going from a 10 kilo average increase of some sort of performance metric to literally decreasing performance over time. Like, it is possible within 2 standard deviations for someone to get worse over time. And so I think that's really important from an application perspective, because we have clients who start new training programs, or if you're listening to this and you start a new training program and, again, we're asking, what should I expect? My friend ran this program. They recommended it to me because they increased their squat by 20 kilos over the course of the program. And, so I'm going into it expecting that I'll, increase my squat by 20 kilos as well. But clearly that's not how that works. And if you don't know the conversion from kilos to pounds, you multiply by 2.2. So that's even more if you're going in poundage, if you're training in the US. Like, that is a very, very large difference. That's a whole 45-pound plate that you're adding to something that could be the difference between you and someone else making progress across the program.
I bet most of your audience is American, right?
Christina would know the stats on that better than I do.
I think it's 90% of our listeners are in the US.
Okay, I've just gotten too used to working in kilos. Pounds is fine. That's my medium.
Yeah, I actually, the gym that I train at, Core Nutritionals HQ, we have all of our dumbbells in kilos. And so It's kind of like tripped me upside down, because now if I'm doing a chest press or a split squat and I'm holding dumbbells, I'm like, I'm holding the 20s. I'm just a weak bitch. and then I'm like reminding myself after I do all the sets, like, oh, it actually weighs this much. I feel a lot better about myself now. So to kind of segue us into the next topic, just kind of talking about the reasons why we see these variations in responses, because it's one thing to say, hey, you can't expect to make the same gains as your best friend on this same program just because they ran it and they saw good results. That doesn't really leave us anywhere in terms of giving people, reasons, answers, and kind of the information as to why this might be. And so kind of getting into the mechanisms of why we might see these drastic responses between individuals. So I think the first thing we have written down here on our outline is genetic variation. So I know there's been some really interesting studies with that, that Greg, you've kind of reviewed in more detail, but just the genetics of one person versus another and how that might impact their response to a diet intervention or a training protocol. Would you want to give us some more insight into that?
I can try. So when it comes to the way that genetics impact training responses, it's difficult to methodologically determine much. So the dominant paradigm for a long time was twin studies, where basically you look to see how similarly monozygotic twins, so like identical twins, respond to something versus dizygotic twins or fraternal twins versus siblings versus parents versus like completely unrelated folks, and then try to make inferences about genetic contributions from there. So, you know, if you see that identical twins respond to something, you know, almost identically, and then you see that there's quite a bit of variation between siblings who aren't identical twins, you would then infer that like, oh, there's probably a pretty strong genetic component to this. And so there are known to be issues with that approach. So some of the assumptions are that the environment that people are dealing with is identical, which it generally wouldn't be like perfectly identical. Another thing that we now know is probably quite important is like uterine environment, which would be the same for identical twins, wouldn't be the same for siblings. Ideally, you would have identical twins versus non-identical twins, but a lot of exercise studies don't have that. Like a lot of them do just use siblings. And there are just some other assumptions baked into that model that aren't entirely correct. So like basically that studies using that sort of research design can kind of like point you in the right direction. Like, hey, things where identical twins have responses that are way more similar to siblings or non-identical twins, there is probably a genetic component to it. But you can't necessarily quantify how strong that genetic component is. Most of the twin research looks at either aerobic training outcomes. So really big study in, I think, the 80s into the early 90s called the Heritage Study was looking, one of the things it looked at was genetic contributions to aerobic training outcomes. And they found that there were genetic contributions that were fairly strong. And overfeeding studies. So there were a couple studies by Bouchard and colleagues in the 90s where basically they would take sets of twins and overfeed them. I want to say the cumulative amount of overfeeding in those studies was pretty crazy. It was like 84,000 calories, give or take. I think it was like 1,000 extra calories per day for close to 3 months. And so they basically wanted to see one, how related the twin pairs were, because that would so if you saw a twin, if they saw that like, oh, some, like for each pair of twins, one twin gained a ton of weight, the other twin didn't, like, yeah, okay, that's probably not a strong genetic contribution to it. But they found that the twin pairs were strongly associated with each other. So like if one twin didn't gain much weight, the other twin probably didn't gain much weight either. So they were pretty strongly associated. So there probably were some genetic contributions. And there was also like a really, really wide range of responses from some twin pairs gaining basically the exact amount of weight one would anticipate they would gain were there no metabolic adaptation whatsoever. So, you overfeed them by 84,000 calories and they store like 82,000 calories worth of new fat. Versus on the bottom end, I want to say the twin pair that responded the best, like quote unquote the best, only stored something like 20 to 30% of the excess calories they consumed as fat. So they didn't really dig into the reasons why. Maybe there were increases in metabolic rate, maybe there were increases in NEAT, maybe they just, I don't know, didn't feel good from overeating that much and so exercising more. But there was like a pretty strong association within twin pairs and a very, very wide array of responses to overfeeding. So that's kind of like the earlier stuff. Then genetic research started shifting more in towards trying to identify specific genes that would be associated with just like muscle strength phenotypes or training responses in general, or just like general body phenotypes. And so that kind of grew out of the excitement of the Human Genome Project. So if you remember anything like from the 90s and early 2000s, when people would talk about genetics, they were like, look, there's this thing going on. It's called the Human Genome Project. Your genes are like a set of instructions that codes for everything your body does. And once we unravel the genome, we will know everything about people, be able to predict everything. It'll be like basically Minority Report. We can have like targeted gene medical therapies, and like it's going to change the world. Everyone's going to be healthy, blah, blah, blah. And there were also some like vaguely eugenic undertones, which weren't great. But anyway, that was kind of the discourse around genetics in the late 90s, early 2000s as the Human Genome Project was wrapping up. They were starting to analyze things. Then we realized that like individual genes aren't predictive of all that much. Most traits are massively polygenic, meaning that a lot of different traits influence them. And if you learned about genetics in, say, high school, you probably just learned about the very small handful of cases where a single gene does matter a lot. So for example, sickle cell anemia, there is just like a gene that if you have like a single letter substitution, someone either has sickle cell or doesn't. But traits like that are pretty rare. Most things are very polygenic. And so when folks started looking at, hey, what they call them allele variants. So like what allele variants? So a single gene, that's an allele. You might have like two different versions of it. And one of the versions may be like quote unquote good for hypertrophy, strength, power, etc. The other version may be quote unquote bad. And the thing is, like, scientists have identified a lot of different alleles that do seem to be associated with strength, muscularity, etc. But none of them are particularly strongly associated with those things. So probably the most enduring and reliable gene that people have found that predicts a power phenotype, so combination of force and velocity, is the ACTN3 gene, which codes for a protein that, I mean, just to simplify it, makes fast twitch fibers twitch fast. And so if you have the good version of that allele, you should be able to produce more power, more velocity, and should be able to be more successful at power sports. Probably doesn't matter all that much for strength sports, but anything where you need to run fast, jump high, the active version of that allele is probably going to be very, very helpful. But even among like the most elite sprinters in the world, something like 15 to 20% of them have at least one copy of the bad version of that allele. And so like, even when you're dealing with like structural and functional proteins that are like one-to-one related to performance in a particular sport, it's not going to be like it's not going to be like perfectly predictive. And ACTN3 is pretty much the best we have. Other gene variants, like there was a study in like 2014, I believe, that went through what were at the time all of the known allele variants that associated with the strength power phenotype, their density within the population, and the amount of like good copies that successful strength and power athletes tended to have. And so there were like 21 that had been identified, and successful strength and power athletes tended to have somewhere in the neighborhood of like between 12 and 16 of like the good versions of these alleles. And people who were just like in the general population tended to have like 8 to 14. So like there was some degree of overlap, and going back to the fact that most traits are polygenic, having a larger number of the good versions of these alleles was predictive, but like no individual allele itself was all that strongly predictive. But the thing is, it's still not going to get you, it's still not going to be perfectly predictive one-to-one. The calculated probability of having the good version of all 21 of the alleles identified in that study was like 1 in 7 trillion, which means like probabilistically no one has ever had all 21 good versions of those alleles. So like, even if like 23andMe say tested for all of those different allele variants, you're going to get an ambiguous picture. Maybe it says you have 15 good ones, which like, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. It's definitely leaning in the positive direction, but there's a lot of successful strength athletes that have fewer, and you only have like about 2/3 of the good ones. Like you can't, you're never going to get that test back and be like, hell yeah, like I can tell 100% from my genetics that I will be an elite strength athlete. Like we're just not there yet. And so, yeah, I mean, we can say very confidently that genetics impact baseline phenotype and also training responses. So I talked about strength and power stuff on kind of like the body composition end of things. It's actually like even worse. So there's, oh man, I wish I would have looked this up before we started recording. There's a FTO, that's what it is. So there's a gene called FTO that is the gene that we found that's most strongly associated with the obese phenotype. But within a population, it's like having 2 bad copies of the FTO allele versus 2 good copies, on average, is associated with a difference in body mass of like 2 or 3 kilos, which like people vary in weight by way more than 2 or 3 kilos. And that's like the strongest, most predictive individual gene we have of the obesity phenotype. So anyway, all of that optimism coming out of the Human Genome Project, like, yeah, we're going to find all of these like individual genes. It's going to be like sickle cell all over again. And we're going to be able to predict exactly how people can perform at sports and whatnot. Like, no, that just hasn't panned out. And so now moving forward, people are getting more into genomics. So instead of analyzing individual genes as like single functional units, looking more into like genome-wide interaction stuff. And in the fields where that's currently being done, so that's mostly like, healthcare, pharmaceutical, stuff like that. Genomics is starting to yield some fairly promising results. Unsurprisingly, that research is very expensive, and unsurprisingly, the NIH doesn't care that much about people being able to put another 10 pounds on their bench press. And so genomics hasn't really made it to strength and hypertrophy research yet, but maybe when it does, they'll find some cool stuff, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, and I think that when you talked about body composition, that's huge, because I've had clients come to me with genetic reports saying, I have this predisposition to this, I have this predisposition, words are hard today, predisposition to something like insulin resistance or obesity, with that FTO gene. And so they're giving me these reports, and really all this is doing, based on what you said, we can't put all of our stock into that. It matters what you do with that information, whether or not it's valid. And so I think that's super important, because if you're coming into, say, a new coaching relationship or a new program or a new diet with those expectations, what is that going to do if those are now the beliefs that you've rooted yourself in? And so I think that's super important that you've just been able to shed so much light on that area of research, because I think for most people, it's intimidating and it's too cloudy for them to be able to decipher and read on their own. And so just that kind of overarching view of what we're actually looking at and where the research really is at this point is so important, because, you know, not to, you know, discredit those companies that are trying to do something good for people, but, you know, maybe focusing more on what you can do with the genetics that you may or may not know that you have, and just trying to be the best version of yourself that you can with whatever programs or customized protocols that you can, without really worrying about those nitty-gritty details.
So on that topic, two things I would add is, one, if you do get, if you're interested in doing a genetic test like 23andMe or something similar, I think an important thing to ask yourself is, when you get that information, what do you intend to do with it, right? So there are definitely some individual genes that you could look at and make lifestyle modifications based on them. So the first two I'm going to throw out, I don't remember what genes they are because this is somewhat outside my wheelhouse, but there are, there have been some genes identified that seem to relate pretty strongly to whether or not and the degree to which saturated fat intake is going to impact your LDL cholesterol. So if you have like the bad version of that gene, probably a good idea to minimize saturated fat intake. And if you have the good version of that gene and you want to eat some steak, like, yeah, it's probably not going to have that much of an impact on you. So, you know, that's like a gene that you could look at and make some like pretty targeted dietary changes based on. There's also a gene that impacts the degree to which sodium intake influences blood pressure. So if you have the good version of that gene, basically sodium intake doesn't matter.
I'm gonna raise
and
my
like,
hand for that one.
yeah. And so like, you know, that's good to know. Like you can probably eat salty foods and really suffer no ill effects from them. If you do have like the bad version of that gene, you should probably watch sodium intake pretty closely. Don't take this as health advice. This is just kind of averages based on research. Talk with your doctor, etc. Something that is a little bit more within my wheelhouse is if you're someone who is really into consuming caffeine, there's a gene called CYP1A2, which codes for the enzyme that's the rate-limiting enzyme in caffeine metabolism. And if you have the good version of that gene, the fast metabolizer version of that gene, one, generally you're going to suffer fewer like short-term ill effects of high caffeine intake. So, you know, you're less likely to feel jittery or paranoid if you consume a lot of caffeine in one dose. It's probably also going to have a smaller impact on sleep because you do metabolize it faster. So, you know, if you consume a big cup of coffee around noon, more of the caffeine is going to be out of your system by the time you're trying to go to sleep. And also long-term health ramifications. It seems like caffeine intake doesn't really correlate with long-term health outcomes really positively or negatively if you're a fast metabolizer. Whereas if you're a slow metabolizer of caffeine, if you consume it in large doses, you're more likely to suffer more notable short-term psychological effects. So more paranoia, more jitteriness. And long-term, if you consume a lot of caffeinated beverages and you're a slow metabolizer, it seems to be associated with heart disease risk. And so like, you know, those are some examples where if you did do a 23andMe, you might want to look at the ones related to saturated fat and cholesterol, the ones related to sodium and blood pressure, CYP1A2 for caffeine metabolism, because those are individual genes that you could look at and potentially make some dietary or lifestyle modifications based on them. Whereas like you mentioned, the FTO gene, if you look at that and you see like, oh, I have the good version, like, what are you going to do? Start eating at a buffet every day? No. Like, and if you have the bad version, what are you going to do? Like, just become completely fatalistic and say like, no, like I'm screwed. I can never lose weight. Like, I don't know what actionable steps you can take based on that information. You know what I mean? And the other thing I'll add is there was a study that I reviewed in Mass sometime last year that was looking at the impact of genetics versus genetics expectations. So basically what they did is they took a group of people, and this relates to the FTO gene. So they took a group of people, they tested them for a couple different genes, one of which related to aerobic exercise performance, and one of which was the FTO gene, which in terms of phenotype associates with body fatness, but in terms of perceptions, people with like the bad version of the FTO gene tend to feel more hunger and less satiation after food, and that's probably why it mediates that relationship with body weight. And so what they did is they gene tested all of these people, got the results back, and told some people the correct results and lied to some people. So basically there was a group of people who had the good version of the FTO gene and they said, hey, you have the good version. There was a group of people who had the good version. They said, hey, you have the bad version. There's a group of people who had the bad version. They said, you have the good version. There's a group of people who had the bad version. They said, you have the bad version. And then they fed them a standardized meal and then asked them about hunger, satiation, etc. I forget exactly how long, but some standardized period of time after the meal. And they found that expectations of genetics had a larger impact on those perceptions than actual genetics. So basically, if you thought you had the good version of the FTO gene, you would perceive more satiation and less hunger than if you thought you had the bad version. And the impact of that belief was stronger than the actual impact of the gene itself. So the difference between, good expectations and bad expectations was larger than the difference between good version of the gene and bad version of the gene. And so if you're looking for genetic information that you can use to make actual targeted changes, I think that's good information to have. I think for pretty much anything else, like, the FTO gene, the ACTN3 gene, any of the ones that are associated with strength, power, body comp, whatever, I really think your best option is just to not get tested and just assume you have the good versions. Because like, I don't see a downside in that. Because like, if you do find out you have the bad versions, that's probably going to lower the expectations you have for yourself, which isn't going to be great. And I don't know what actual concrete decisions you would make based on that information to work around those perceived limitations. So yeah, I think the risk of just noceboing yourself more often than not outweighs the benefits you would get just from having the information.
I think that's so interesting, the idea that perceptions could basically kind of trump genetics in that particular study. And as a school counselor, something that we learned in was they did a study with students and they told one group like, oh, you guys are super smart. Like you're so smart and everything is so easy for you. And they told another group, wow, you work really hard and you're just the hardest worker I've ever seen. And then they gave them all this very, very difficult, I think it was like a math test or math problems. And the kids that were told that they were smart gave up quicker than the kids who were told that they were hard workers, and they would try harder and harder and harder and would eventually give up if they couldn't solve it. But I just think that's so interesting. It's like you have these kids are all right around the same smartness level and just by telling them something different, you can change the outcome of of what they're going to do. So I think that's interesting when it comes to genetics, because I do have clients who think that if I don't have the genetics like this other person I see on Instagram, then I'm not going to be able to see any progress, and I might as well just give up now.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, so more directly related to like strength outcomes, because that's what I care about. Probably, so there were two studies which honestly are super neat, and I don't think anyone has attempted to replicate them in a while, which is a shame. But there was a study back in 1974. A guy named Ariel was the lead author. And what they did in this study is they took a group of people, they trained them they had them trained for 7 weeks. And as kind of an incentive to get them to train hard and try to make as large of gains as possible in the first 7 weeks, they said like, hey, the people who have the best results, we're going to give you D-ball after this, because this is the 70s, steroids are legal, not as stigmatized. And so these folks trained for 7 weeks, try to make the most gains possible. They were like fairly well trained in the first place, and also they had the just most brotastic strength outcomes. So they looked at squat, and then they looked at bench press and seated military press and standing military press. It was like a very, very pressing focused study, which is sick. So anyway, they put an average of 10 kilos across those 4 lifts over the first 7 weeks of training. And then like the authors lied to them. They took everyone from the first 7 weeks and said like, hey, you were among the best. Now here's some D-ball, but it was just like saccharin pills. So they gave them fake D-ball for 4 weeks. And over 4 weeks, they put a combined total of like 45 kilos, so like 100 pounds over those 4 lifts. So they made gains at like 7 times the rate they did in the first 7 weeks of the study, just because they thought they were taking steroids when they weren't. And then
that's awesome.
Oh yeah, it's so cool. And then in 2001, who was the lead author on this? I think it was Karagorgis or something like that. Regardless, so there was a study. This is actually my favorite study of all time, just because like you read it and it's in kind of like dry scientific language, but then you think through, okay, like what's actually going on here on a human level, and it's hilarious. So apparently the Great Britain national powerlifting team, like in their IPF affiliate, they all decided like, hey, we want to do drugs, which is not allowed in the IPF and wasn't at the time. But they just got it in their head like, hey, we think the people we're competing against are on gear. We want to do steroids too. And so they went to their coach, who was also a researcher, and said like, hey man, can you hook us up with some steroids? And their coach, this researcher, said, sure, absolutely. I got your back. And he realized like, oh, this is a perfect time to do some placebo research. And so he gave them placebo pills. And also the other very funny aspect of this study is that this is 2001. Like the internet exists, Google exists. These guys should have known how steroids functioned, but like the way the study works showed that they didn't know how they functioned. So like when you take steroids, like over time it helps you build more muscle and strength. But like if you went to the doctor today and got an injection, or like you went to an anti-aging clinic that was very like quote unquote understanding, and they gave you some D-ball, you're not going to pop your first D-ball and hit like a huge deadlift PR tonight. Like that's just not how steroids work. But anyway, apparently the people in the study didn't know this. So 2 weeks before the study started, they tested their squat, bench, and deadlift 1 rep max. 2 weeks later, their coach gives them what he says is steroids. It's actually just a placebo pill. And they put an average of close to 5% on their three lifts. And so like keep in mind, these are world-class competitors. They're squatting and benching about 600 pounds on average, or squatting and deadlifting about 600, benching high fours. So when you're putting 5% on a squat or a deadlift in the 600s, that's like a 30-pound PR. And that was just like on the basis of the placebo effect. And then the coach kept giving them these fake pills, had them train for 2 weeks, asked them kind of qualitatively at the end of those 2 weeks, like, hey, how's it going? And everyone's like, man, best 2 weeks of training of my life. I'm recovering like crazy, hitting bigger numbers than I ever have, volumes off the chain. Like, this is absolutely fantastic. I love steroids. And then he told half of them, psych, this was a placebo the whole time. And let the other half keep thinking that they were still taking steroids. And the ones who still thought they were taking steroids PR'd again after the 2 weeks. And the people who had then found out that they had been using placebos the whole time, even though they have the knowledge, like, hey, these 2 fantastic weeks of training, I actually did those drug-free. Like, that's all me. They regressed to their pre-training numbers. So not like the numbers they did after the first placebo pill, but like the numbers they did 2 weeks prior to that. Just to illustrate how large of an impact the placebo effect and expectancy effects can have on strength results. But anyway, I just love that study because it's got everything. It's got the human drama. It's got the lack of willingness to Google how steroids work. It's got people trying to cheat. It's got someone in a trusted position of authority betraying his trust for the greater good of research. It's got everything you could ever want in a study. It's absolutely fantastic.
We're going to have all these coaches out here now, like giving their clients steroids.
What you're saying is, screw everything we're talking about in this podcast, and everyone just needs to placebo themselves into thinking that they're on drugs.
Big takeaway.
If there was a way to do it, I would 100% recommend that. Actually, I kind of think that happens more than people realize. So there have also been some studies where researchers basically just like go on the black market sites where people would buy steroids and buy up a bunch of steroids and then do biochemical analysis to see like what's actually in this stuff. And a lot of times it's just completely bunk. So a lot of them are underdosed, and a lot of them just aren't the substance they say they are. So like it's kind of common to just like give people DHEA or androstenedione, but like say it's testosterone or something. And if you have like normal hormone levels, DHEA, androstenedione, like they're not going to do anything for you. Or, it is like the thing they say it is, but it's just horrendously underdosed. So I do actually kind of think a lot of it would be impossible to know how often this happens, but at least to some degree, there are a lot of people out there who think they're on gear who are actually just placeboing themselves. And I would love to know what their games look like.
Yeah, seriously. I think, that's really, man, that's great. It's like the supplement industry, but it's just like one step above that.
Yeah.
With the underdosing and everything. But I think that really plays into, okay, what do you do with what your expectations now are? And I see this a lot in clients who have been diagnosed with PCOS, because there is a stigma amongst those types of women who, they now believe that weight loss is impossible for them, or it's just going to be so difficult for them that it's just not worth it. So then what I see in those people is a lack of will or a lack of ability to grasp that if maybe they could just be consistent with what they're trying to do, that they could see better results than if they maybe, didn't have that diagnosis affecting their beliefs and then therefore their actions. Because I think if there's one thing that Christina and I preach as coaches all the time, is that what you believe is going to directly affect what you do, whether that is with your training program or your nutrition. If you believe that you are not going to be successful, and you're not going to take the steps to get there. So would it be better or worse to, even if you know that you have a diagnosis, or, this even goes into the conversation of like an injury, if you have, for example, I have 2 herniated discs, but did I let myself believe that I was never going to squat or deadlift ever again? No. And I made sure that I was continually practicing to believe, I'm going to get back to where, to those movements, I'm going to be able to do those things pain-free. But if you tell yourself that you're screwed for life and you should just stop exercising, that's going to influence your actions. So I think that's super important in just like the nature versus nurture kind of argument. So, whether that's with genetics, or that's with your beliefs, what do you do with that as you grow up and as you go through different life experiences? How do you allow those beliefs and experiences to shape what you actually do? Because you might get farther with the worst genetics and, the worst predispositions to every single, obesity, can't put on muscle, but if you work your ass off, you might get 10 times farther than someone who maybe just, is in the same position as you, but believes that, they wouldn't be able to achieve that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, so you can make an argument both ways. So if your only consideration is what is likely to get you the farthest, having good expectations is an unmitigated positive. It's generally going to help you like be more consistent, put in more effort, and get farther than you would have otherwise. People may then wonder like why someone would have bad expectations. And the thing is, like, it does serve a purpose. It's to some degree like a psychological defense mechanism, because then if you do fail, it's not going to be as much of like an identity threat. It's not going to affect your self-efficacy as much. So like I don't necessarily begrudge people having low expectations, because like it does actually serve a purpose for them. But yeah, if your actual goal is to get as far as you possibly can in whatever your physical pursuits are, yeah, I mean, just anticipate that you're going to get good results, and behave as someone would who had the potential for good results.
And I think that's a really good kind of tactic to use with clients, or to use with, if you're a coach, is like, hey, if you want to, increase your weight for squat, or if you want to be a pro bodybuilder, if you want to do this, how would someone like that act? And you need to emulate those actions and do that yourself. Like you already are, you're going to do that, rather than going into each session like, I'm a failure, I'm never going to be able to do this. Like, oh, of course this workout sucked. Like, and I just think that's so crazy how powerful the mind is, and how it can be kind of nature versus nurture. Is if you grow up in an environment when you have people who are supportive of you and your goals, like how maybe your genetics aren't as good as someone else's, but because of that environment, you just are on a different level than someone who maybe has better genetics than you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's a good heuristic, like, have in mind, like, hey, how would these people likely behave? But then don't actually go ask them. Some of the most gifted athletes, and just like to hammer home how large like variations in genetics and propensities for physical pursuits are. Dude, some elite athletes, their genetics are just so far on another level. It's outrageous. So Eddie Lacy, who was a really successful running back at Alabama and ended up making it to the NFL and getting bounced out of the league because like he couldn't stay at the appropriate weight. everyone who's ever worked with him says like, oh yeah, Eddie, nice guy, love the kid, can't get him to work out, like can't get him to do anything. But like he was still like a pretty high draft pick in the NFL. So, do with that what you will. Or like Kevin Levrone, who won more bodybuilding shows than anyone else in the 90s. Quite famously, generally took half the year off of bodybuilding training because he was also the singer of a metal band. And so he would just go on tour every summer. And, I'm sure he still did some stuff on the road, but like he'd lose like 40 pounds every year. And then by the time the Olympia rolled around, he was absolutely huge and peeled and ready to go again.
Wow.
But yeah, so ask yourself how elite athletes who don't
Should
have
act.
the best possible genetics got to that point. Not necessarily every elite athlete.
Yeah, well, I feel like everyone knows those, that one person who doesn't have to do a whole lot, or, they can eat whatever they want and they have a six-pack like all the time, and you have to like work so hard to like just not get fat. And it's like everyone hates those people, everyone knows them, and it's like, okay, if you're like, okay, well, I know my genetics aren't as good as theirs, but it's like what you do with that information is more important than just hating those people more.
For sure.
Yeah, it's the battle between the talented athlete that doesn't work hard and the maybe not so talented athlete that works their butt off. Who's going to get farther in the end? That's up to work ethic at the end of the day. Unless someone is so freakishly talented that maybe they can get away with it, but that's the 0.0001%. And to kind of backtrack a little bit, I think that there's really a balance and an interplay between those low and those high expectations that you might have for yourself. And I think this is important for our audience listening, because on one hand, we say, hey, you should have good expectations when you set off on your journey, because obviously that would help you to adhere and to hopefully do more than if you had walked into it with bad expectations. But those low expectations do serve a purpose, like Greg pointed out, and they can be kind of a defense mechanism so that you just don't have this like total identity crisis if you do fail, like he said. And so I think you can strike a really nice balance in between that. And I'm going to use myself as an example because I think I can definitely relate to this in one way or another with my back. So I'm coming up on like 2 years of dealing with some pretty recurring back issues. I do have herniated discs, but I'm not letting that determine what I do or what I don't do. I'm just playing it by feel and what I'm capable of in any given moment or training cycle. And so, yeah, my goal is to get back to all the movements that I want to do and be pain-free doing that. I want to squat. I want to deadlift. I want to improve my 1 rep maxes eventually. I want to be able to rep the most weight that I ever have in my life in the future and not have that just be in the past. But at the end of the day, if I don't get there, and maybe I'm somewhere in between, where I am now and that lofty goal in the future, and that's where I end up for the rest of my life, and I have that fallback of like, well, I do know that this is my circumstance, and it's not necessarily an excuse because I'm not letting that become an excuse when it comes to my actions and what I practice, but at least allowing that to be like, okay, well, at least I'm not like completely devastated. And also think about everything that you did leading up to that point, to that realization, right? Like you worked your ass off. You did all of your mobility, all of your stretching, like to get yourself to that point, all of your modified exercises. Maybe you worked on your weak points so that you could bring up your squat in a better and stronger way the next time you put that bar on your back, and so that's something that I can definitely relate to with kind of mixing those expectations. So like if all else fails, I still did a crap ton of awesome stuff along the way. Maybe I didn't get to that, end desired point, whether that's becoming a pro athlete or just for me getting back to having a bar loaded on my back. And so that's, something that you can kind of take away from. It doesn't have to be black or white. You can only have low expectations for yourself, or you can only set yourself up for great beliefs with what you can do and your high expectations, you can kind of intermingle those two things and you know, set yourself up for success that way.
For sure. And I think having goals and expectations on different time scales can help a lot as well. So, you know, if someone comes to train with you and maybe they haven't had great success with outcomes in the past, like they've struggled building muscle, they've struggled getting stronger. And so maybe they don't have, and I mean, very understandably so, don't have super high expectations for what they're going to get out of it. A good way to help people build self-efficacy is to focus more on process goals on the front end. So say like, hey, look, you know, your mindset is what it is. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going to tell you that what you believe and what you expect is wrong. But you know, what might someone do if they were going to get a lot stronger, build a lot of muscle? You know, get enough sleep every night, hit their macros on a daily basis, you know, get to the gym 3-4 times a week, like all of your prescribed workouts. So like, let's focus on that. Okay. Like here are the things that you would need to do to get substantially better. So like, that's what we're going to focus on for the time being. And then when people do start seeing that, like, oh yeah, like I can do this. I am getting all of my workouts. I am hitting my prescribed weights. I am getting in bed every night. I am pretty consistently hitting my nutrition targets. Then that can start building kind of like a level of self-belief that can become generalizable. Like, hey, if I can consistently do all of the things that I need to do to make progress, why should I not be able to make progress? You know? And so like, that's a way to kind of bridge that gap as well.
Yeah.
I love that.
Christina and I work with a lot of women, and I think this can be super important for those people listening. And I have a number of clients where it's like, we go with that mindset, right? Like, what do you have to lose? Like, if you don't say lose the 10 or 20 pounds that you're looking to lose in this 3-month time frame, well, what else have you accomplished in that time frame? And we are so big on being process oriented, and we've done like a whole portion of a podcast on it too, because that's really the nature of how we coach. And so if you're not celebrating those wins along the way, and you're not enjoying the process as you go, you know, what is that outcome even going to mean to you at the end? And that's not to discredit the fact that, you know, achieving that outcome that you set your mind to is a good thing, and you should be proud of yourself for that. But there's so much that comes along with it, that, you know, once you learn the beauty of the process, you know, that outcome almost becomes less important to you because of all of these habits and lifestyle changes that you've picked up along the way.
For sure.
There is one other reason, I guess, that causes a lot of variation in training response, and it's a pretty obvious one, and I really wanted to get more detail from you specifically on this in this episode, so I wanted to cover it, and that is gender differences. So I know you did your master's thesis on one aspect of how gender might affect fatigability in men versus women. And I think that this was a super interesting study, and your results were pretty cool. So I would love for our audience to hear a little bit more about that, before we kind of zoom out and go practical applications and then conclude the episode.
Sure. So I'll start with like outcome-based stuff. So just how well people can build muscle, get stronger, etc. I was thinking for my thesis project, I was originally going to do a training study. And then it turned out that there just wouldn't be enough lab space and enough resources to pull that off. But that's what I was thinking I wanted to do initially. And so I wanted to get a baseline of like, hey, if we're comparing men and women, males and females, what relative differences should we be anticipating? And that just seemed like something where there would be a meta-analysis, but there wasn't. And so I did one initially for the site Stronger by Science. And then Brandon Roberts hit me up and said like, hey, do you want to formalize this and get it published? And I said, okay, sure, that sounds cool. So we did that. And unsurprisingly, on an absolute basis, so just like, sheer pounds on the bar, pounds of lean mass, etc., men do build more strength and more muscle than women do. But on a relative basis, so like percentage increase relative to one's starting point, it's actually pretty similar. So, if a man starts with, I'm going to go back to kilos because I always give this example in kilos, with 30 kilos of skeletal muscle mass, so probably going to be a fair bit more lean mass, but 30 kilos of actual skeletal muscle mass, and then trains for a while and puts on 6 kilos of additional muscle. That's a 20% increase. So a woman may start with 20 kilos of skeletal muscle mass, and a similar relative increase would be about a 4 kilo increase. And that's what we tend to see. So larger absolute gains in males, but similar relative gains in both sexes. So anyway, I did that. That's good information to have. Ended up not being useful to my thesis at all, because I had to do an acute study. And so I was interested in looking into sex differences in fatigability and recovery after training. And when I did my literature search, what I found is that for fatigability stuff, for the most part, it seems like females are less fatigable than males. But the sorts of experimental protocols didn't have a ton of ecological validity. So in other words, it didn't necessarily look like the way most people might train day to day in the gym. So it may look at, total reps completed across 4 sets when you're taking every set truly to failure, like until someone actually fails a rep. Or it might look like decrements in peak concentric force during 70 concentric reps at a knee angular velocity of 60 degrees per second, which like no one's doing their knee extensions on a isokinetic dynamometer. So anyway, that was the type of stuff that was in the research to that point. Generally finding either similar fatigability between the sexes, or maybe females being a bit less fatigable than males. Interestingly, I think the most applicable and also most brutal study in the area came from the early 90s from Kio Hakkanen up in, which Scandinavian country is that? I think he's from Finland. I hope he's from Finland. It's either Norway or Finland. But anyway, had people do 10 sets of a 10 RM on squats. So like reasonably well-trained people started with their 10 RM and then basically like decrease the load a little bit per set with the target of them still being able to complete 10 reps, but be right at the point of failure after 10 reps. And found that like the decrements in loads that the subjects were able to use, the decrements were larger in males than females. Which again doesn't have like great ecological validity, but like that was one of the few studies where they actually got people in the weight room and really had them get after it. But anyway, so I wanted to do, actually 1 second. So that's fatigability. Another thing worth noting is the mechanistic stuff when it comes to fatigability is really interesting. So the kind of god of that research area is named Sandra Hunter. She has some really, really good original research and some really good review papers on the subject. Most of the fatigability research uses isometric exercise, which again isn't the most generalizable to general like day-to-day training contexts. But she did some really cool studies when she was in Roger Anoka's lab, basically looking to see what physiological differences might be contributing to sex differences in fatigability. And so in one study, basically recruit a group of males, group of females, have them do isometric bicep curls at a fixed percentage of maximal force, and just basically hold it until their biceps gave out. And the variable they were looking at was time to task failure. Really big differences between sexes. The females could hold the contraction for considerably longer than the males could. Then in a follow-up study, they recruited two groups that were matched for elbow flexion strength. So basically they would find a pair of one male, one female, where their isometric elbow flexion strength was within about 5% of each other. And then in that study, there were no differences between the sexes. And then they did another study where instead of just holding an isometric contraction the whole time without any rest, I want to say it was hold it for 6 seconds, relax for 4 seconds, hold it for 6 seconds, relax for 4 seconds. I think it was 6 and 4. It may have been 3 and 2. I think it was 6 and 4 though. And so then when they did that, there were pretty big differences between sexes again, even when matched for strength. And there are several mechanisms which could explain some of the sex differences in fatigability, but based on those results and some other ones, it seems like probably the largest contributor is differences in blood flow. And so, and that goes 2 different ways. One is basically independent of sex. When your muscles contract, they circumferentially expand. So, if your bicep is relaxed, it has like a certain circumference. And then if you flex it, like the circumference of it will increase. And that puts pressure on blood vessels, both veins and arteries. So initially it's going to include venous blood flow. You can't clear waste products as well. And then eventually it can start including arterial blood flow. And then you can't get more oxygen to the muscle. And then at that point, you're done for. Like you have maybe 10 seconds after arterial blood flow is occluded, and then you're going to fail. So people with smaller muscles, regardless of sex, have less relative circumferential expansion of the muscles. And so that's putting less pressure on blood vessels during exercise. So in general, females tend to have smaller muscles than males. And so they're probably able to maintain blood flow during submaximal contractions better than males can, and can maintain blood flow up to a higher relative level of submaximal contractions than males can. So that probably explains the finding when you don't strength match males and females, have them hold an isometric contraction, the females can go longer. And just holding an isometric contraction with strength matched, it's pretty similar because at that point, muscle size is probably pretty similar. And so you're probably getting a similar level of occlusion into the muscles. And then the other thing, which is really cool, is I'm blanking on the technical term. Now that I'm out of grad school, I don't use technical terminology at all anymore. It's so dumb. But basically, reperfusion, that's it. So post-exercise reperfusion also seems to be greater in females than males. So there was another study where, so the study I mentioned where basically it was the hold a contraction for 6 seconds, relax for 4, hold for 6, relax for 4. If memory serves, they didn't actually look at any blood flow kinetics in that study. But there was another study where they basically were doing a knee extension protocol in males and females, and they were looking at blood flow during the sets and also immediately after the sets. And they found that dilation of the femoral artery and blood flow to the quads during the rest periods was greater in the female subjects than the male subjects. So basically, like, that's something that happens with everyone. When you're exercising a muscle, you're going to shunt more blood flow to it. Your arterioles are going to open up more to get more blood flow. You're going to have more capillary flow, etc. And basically, it seems like that whole process of shunting blood towards active muscles and being able to clear waste products and deliver more oxygen during rest periods seems to function a little bit more efficiently in females than males, which probably explains that finding that even when you strength match males and females during that 6 seconds on, 4 seconds off isometric procedure to failure. The strength match females were still able to go for a lot longer than the males. And so basically, what I wanted to do with my study was have a protocol where people weren't training to failure every set, because when you're training to failure, then you're working in mechanisms of fatigue that aren't primarily metabolic. So you take someone to failure, you're going to have more muscle damage accumulated per set. That's going to affect neural stuff. So, if the sarcolemma is disrupted, you're not going to propagate nerve signals as efficiently. You might have trouble resequestering calcium. And so like basically you're dealing with different mechanisms of fatigue. And I really wanted to like dial in on the primarily metabolic mechanisms of fatigue. And so what I had my subjects do, they'd come to the lab. First session, they'd work up to a 1 rep max. Second session, they'd come in, work up to a 1 rep max, and then do a single set to failure at 75% of whatever the better of the two 1RMs in their first 2 sessions were. And then in their third session, that was the big, most important session. The protocol used was 75% bench pressing for sets of 5 reps with 90 seconds between sets, very, very strictly timed. And just repeating sets of 5 every 90 seconds, or with 90 seconds between sets until they eventually reach the point of failure, with the outcome variable being total number of reps completed during that protocol. And then for the next 3 days, just monitoring recovery. So we worked them back up to 80% on bench every day. We got their load velocity profile to see, basically how velocity recovery was proceeding. And then also just had them fill out a visual analog scale to assess muscle soreness. And so that was the study. That's what we did. And we found that so first off, I'm really proud of the sample I was able to recruit. I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but the folks were similarly well trained. I think the average bench press for the males was maybe 120 kilos thereabouts, and for the females it was 64, 65. So that may not be right. I haven't looked at my data in a long time, if I'm being honest. So who cares about the 1 rep max numbers? They were fairly well trained by the standards of the research. And what I was most excited about is the female and male samples that I recruited were similarly trained to each other. So the new IPF scoring system, the bench press score was similar between the males and females. In terms of single set strength endurance, so number of reps that could be completed during a single set to failure at 75%, similar between sexes, which is actually a pretty consistent finding in the research. I see people say all the time that one of the big differences between the sexes is that females can do way more reps to failure with a given percentage of 1 rep max than males. I haven't found that to be true in my coaching. I haven't found that to be true in the research, and that wasn't true in my study. I think that, honestly, I think a lot of that is just related to the fact that, I don't know, the internet found a very small handful of women who are really good at doing reps, and they said haha, this generalizes to an entire sex. But anyway, it doesn't seem to be true on a generalizable basis, but whatever.
Well, I think people have found that because women generally if you look at their training, they tend to do a lot more volume with less intensity when compared to men. So I mean, because that's what I've found for for people who say that women tend to recover better too. That's part of the reason.
I mean, I could definitely see that being the case. But anyway, so I identified differences between my two groups in terms of single set strength endurance. But during that fatigue protocol, the sets of 5 with 90 seconds in between, there was a huge difference between sexes. So just dealing with round numbers, the males tended to complete about 5 sets and fail on the 6th. and the females tended to complete about 11 sets and fail on the 12th. So it was almost a twofold difference. Going back to where this conversation started, there was a lot of variation there. So I want to say my worst performing male failed either on his second or third set, and the best performing male, I think, completed 10 and failed on his 11th set. And I think my worst performing female completed either 3 or 4 sets and failed on either the 4th or 5th. And my best performing female, I remember this vividly, completed 24 sets and failed on her 25th, which was absolutely bonkers. She was incredible. But anyway, so on average, there was like a twofold difference between the sexes in terms of what was completed during that fatigue protocol. I also didn't have a setup to measure blood flow, but since I was collecting bar speed on every rep, I could look at changes in bar speed as a proxy for fatigue during each set and recovery between sets. So fatigue during each set was operationally defined as the decrease in bar speed from the first rep to the last rep of each set. And then recovery between sets was operationally defined as the increase in bar speed from the last rep of one set to the first rep of the next set. And what I found is between my males and females, the fatigue within each set was the same. So the rate at which bar speed declined within sets didn't differ between the sexes, but there was a significant difference in bar speed recovery between sets. And that largely explained why the females were able to complete more reps during that fatigue protocol. So that plays into the idea that like intraset rate of fatigue is pretty similar, but across a session, females probably use the recovery time a bit more efficiently and recover faster between sets. And then in terms of the recovery outcomes, soreness, similar, recovery of bar velocity, similar. So no big differences between the sexes there. I did some exploratory analyses. The only thing that actually hit, I'm almost positive, was a false positive. Found that folks who slept more, like who got more hours of sleep and higher quality sleep the night after the fatigue protocol, tended to be more sore the next day. And like, I don't think I can make a convincing case that sleeping more is bad for exercise recovery. So I'm almost positive that was just a false positive. Those were my findings. I talked about in the literature, like the general fatigue stuff before. Recovery stuff is similar. You can find some studies where females recover a little bit better. You can find some studies where recovery is pretty similar between the sexes. I think, so the cool thing about my findings is that like almost twice as many total reps were completed, but the females recovered similarly to the males, which would potentially suggest that if they did the same amount of volume, they would have recovered faster. Obviously, you can't test that counterfactual, but one of the other things could have just been that like maybe people accrue a kind of fixed amount of fatigue if they do eventually reach failure, and the males and females did both eventually reach failure, and therefore recovery was similar. But yeah, that's what I found.
I think that can also play into, women being able to do more volume in their sessions as well. I think that's definitely a stigma, is like women tend to do, whether it's high or low intensity, I see women being able to handle a lot more volume, and it's probably because of that inter-set recovery, I believe is correct.
Yeah.
Intra and inter, always I get them flipped back and forth. So this is a side tangent, and we don't have to go into this because I don't want this podcast to be 5 hours long. But
was that a subtle dig at the Stronger by Science podcast?
Your bi-weekly 5-hour episodes.
I think we've only cleared 3 hours once.
I can personally listen to it because I just get in my car, and whenever it turns on, I listen to it for the duration of the drive, and I just pick it up every single time I drive. But
that's smart.
Not everyone is like that. So, but I would be so curious because blood flow restriction training, partially occludes blood flow. And
Mhm.
I'd be so curious to see how that might affect differences between sex, because the typical protocol for a blood flow restriction, if you're listening to this and you don't know, this is when you wrap a little band or rubber band or fabric band around an area, like usually upper arm or upper thigh, and you perform with a very, very low percentage of your 1 rep max on a movement, say like a hip thrust or a bicep curl. You're using like 20-30%, but you're doing 30 reps, then you're resting like 30, maybe 60 seconds, and then you're doing 3 sets of 15 with that short rest in between. Because women have that, better interset recovery, I'd be so curious to see how that might be affected, or how someone, male versus female, might see results from something like that. And I don't really think that there's been anything done on that, but I'm just like, that's the first thing that popped in my head, because I just listened to another podcast on BFR. I was like, wow, that would be so cool.
So here's something that's it's a little snippet of a thought that's probably not actually useful to anyone. There was a study that was not looking at BFR itself, but it was kind of like a mechanistic study. So the idea that metabolic stress inherently has a contributory effect to hypertrophy. There was a study that wanted to isolate that. So most of the studies someone would use to make that case is basically like one group trains with relatively high loads and one group trains with relatively low loads. They both train to failure. They end up getting similar hypertrophy. And then people argue like, oh, the high loads cause more mechanical tension, obviously, but yet hypertrophy was similar. Therefore, the extra metabolic stress induced with the low loads must have contributed to that hypertrophy response. But the thing is, like, there are more variables in play than just high metabolic stress, low metabolic stress. So it doesn't actually answer the question. So there was a study that basically did want to answer the question, where they put 2 groups through the exact same training protocol, but the difference between groups is after all of the sets were completed, one of the groups would then do blood flow restriction afterwards. So basically, like, you build up metabolic stress, those metabolites can escape via your veins. So then you occlude venous blood flow to make sure all of those metabolites just hang out in the muscles for like 5 or 10 minutes or something after your training. So the training stimulus was the same, but one of the groups would have accrued more total metabolic stress than the other group. And I gotta say, I haven't read that study in a long time, and I don't remember what the outcomes were, but I do remember that there was a sex difference where some of the responses in the females were different than the males. Or maybe it was 2 different studies, and one was on males, one was on females, and they had different outcomes. So that's a snippet of a thought that if someone wants to chase up those citations, there might be something interesting there, but I forget what it is. Much more relevant in my mind right now is I've been reading about ischemic preconditioning more recently, which also relates to occluding blood flow. Do you guys know about ischemic preconditioning?
No.
Okay, so it's pretty cool. I guess content warning for listeners. I'm about to describe something that could conceivably be construed as animal abuse. So you might want to fast forward for a couple minutes. But anyway, so ischemic preconditioning has been used in like cardiac rehab and cardiac prehab up until pretty recently. So it was initially discovered in either 1984 or 1986. I can't remember which. And I honestly want to know what was going through the researcher's head, but he was just like, hey, maybe if we do some ischemic preconditioning, which I'm about to describe, we can protect dogs against heart attacks. And so basically what they did is they opened up the chest cavity of some dogs, and in one group that underwent ischemic preconditioning, what they did is they cut off blood flow through one of the coronary arteries for 5 minutes, and then let it reperfuse for 5 minutes, cut it off for 5 minutes again, reperfuse for 5 minutes, cut it off for 5 minutes again, reperfuse for 5 minutes. So that's ischemic preconditioning. They put the heart through ischemia in 5-minute segments with 5 minutes of reperfusion. And then they took that group of dogs and another group of dogs that hadn't undergone ischemic preconditioning and cut off blood flow through that artery for 40 minutes straight. And then they compared the infarct size. So the total area of the heart where there was, dead cardiac muscle tissue from the heart attack that they induced. And they found that the group of dogs that had undergone cardiac preconditioning or ischemic preconditioning of the myocardium had a 75% decrease in infarct size. So like the area of the heart affected was only 25% as large in the dogs that had undergone ischemic preconditioning. So then they extended that to research on humans. They found a similar thing to work. So ischemic preconditioning of the myocardium to protect against like the worst outcomes of heart attacks. And then around, I think the first study was 2010, but around 2014, 2015, ischemic preconditioning for exercise really started ramping up. And I guess this is where you could give the timestamp for people who don't want to hear about dogs. So anyway, it's the exact same concept, except you're cutting off blood flow to the limbs instead of to the heart. And unlike blood flow restriction, where you're only trying to occlude venous blood flow, with ischemic preconditioning, you're getting the wraps tight enough to cut off both venous and arterial blood flow. And it works the exact same way that I described before. So you cut off blood flow for 5 minutes, allow it to reperfuse for 5 minutes, and then repeat the process 3 or 4 times, and then put someone through an exercise protocol. And generally, so there have been quite a few studies on aerobic exercise and 7 studies on resistance exercise to this point. And they find that for the resistance exercise stuff, it improves strength endurance pretty reliably, somewhere between like 10 and 20%. So, if you were doing a set to failure and you could generally get 10 reps, now you can maybe get 11 or 12. It may have some other benefits as well. So there was a study doing ischemic preconditioning before an eccentric exercise protocol, and they found smaller elevations and markers of muscle damage and faster recovery in the group that underwent ischemic preconditioning. So really good stuff overall. But there's only been one study. Here's something that was mad frustrating. Never mind, I'll say that in a second. Anyway, so there's only one study looking at sex differences in like strength endurance responses to ischemic preconditioning. And they found that ischemic preconditioning did cause a significant increase in strength endurance in male subjects, but had no effect in female subjects. But it's only one study. And so I wanted to look back at the aerobic training literature and see like, hey, have there been any aerobic training studies that looked at sex differences as well? Because like, maybe if there's like 5 aerobic training studies that find that it's similarly beneficial in males and females, I'd say like, okay, like there's this one strength study, maybe it's a false negative, probably not worth getting too worked up about. But here's the frustrating thing. There were like 40 goddamn studies looking at ischemic preconditioning in an aerobic training context, and all of them only used males, or they used mixed sex samples and didn't split across, like didn't split the males and females for analysis, which like, that's crazy, dog. I don't know. I found it very frustrating.
Especially because so many other areas of research like will distinctively be like, we're not using women because hormones, or we're going to only use women because hormones. And so it's so interesting that is the area where they don't do any sort of separation.
Yeah. So anyway, all of which is to say, we started by talking about blood flow restriction. Ischemic preconditioning is a very particular type of blood flow restriction, and there might be some sex differences in ischemic preconditioning responses.
Huh. Well, we just all learned something new today, I think. But yeah, so to kind of go back to Greg's research and just fatigability in women, sex differences in men versus women with training, and maybe we see that in BFR, or maybe we see that with ischemic preconditioning. But just kind of the overarching points from that discussion. So if you are a woman running the same program as a man, there is a chance that you might do a little bit better with, like, let me just kind of generalize, but of course there's going to be nuances within this. Might do a little bit better with shorter rest periods. You might be able to get in more volume per session versus a man. And it might be because of that interset rest period where you're able to just kind of be more efficient in that rest period. And I think we kind of see this culturally anyways, like with social media culture and fitness, with women kind of being more on the side of like circuit training and kind of doing things with less rest periods, and they want to keep their heart rate up and they want to keep blood flowing at all times. And kind of just doing more volume with maybe lower intensity, like Christina said. So we kind of already see this. And so it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so you might be able to get away with a little bit shorter rest time, a little bit more volume per session. And you might be able to recover a little bit better after sessions as well, I think are the main takeaways. Would you agree, Greg, on your research in that kind of area overall?
I think if you end up doing more volume, then recovery will probably be pretty similar between the sexes. And if you end up doing, if you do a program that's like written, by men, probably with men in mind, and you just do it like 100% as written, you might recover a little bit faster.
That's funny that you say that, because our first episode, we talked about how we like came up into fitness, and my first program that I ever was Jim Stepani's 12 Weeks to Size off of bodybuilding.com. So it was made probably for men, but I saw that and I was like, I want to get jacked. I'm running this.
Hell yeah.
And it went great.
Speaking of Jim Stepani, I spread this to everyone who brings him up. Have you seen his plyometric bicep curl video?
No, but we're gonna
it
find
is
it.
Incredible. It's the funniest thing I've ever seen.
And we're gonna put it in the show notes.
Would highly recommend it. It's so funny.
So, Christina, do you want to kind of wrap up some practical applications from what we got today, and kind of just talk about why do we care about genetic variations and sex differences and responses to training?
Yeah, so I think kind of what you were alluding to earlier is you could have two people, take you and me, for example, and we follow the exact same program. And there's a good chance that we're going to see different results from that program. And that doesn't mean that you're doing the program wrong, or that someone else is doing it better than you. It's just, there are a lot of different variables that go into how much change someone is going to make when they're following a training protocol or a diet protocol. So go into whatever you're doing and have the best possible mindset around that, and doing everything you can to ensure that you will see some progress. And I think it's so cliche, but to not compare your chapters or compare your journey to someone else, and that you need to focus on you and you only. And again, that's not to say that you should have low expectations, but really, I think Greg put it nicely, and Marissa too. It's to enjoy the process and to have process outcome goals, and to, instead of focusing on I need to lose 10 pounds or I need to do X, Y, and Z, but just enjoying the day-to-day and knowing that you're making positive changes in your life.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that kind of wraps it up perfectly, because we have all of these things that we can't control. Like, you can go get 23andMe and you can figure out if you are predispositioned for hypertension or having high LDL, or being more predisposed to getting fat or staying skinny, or getting a bunch of strength gains out of something or not. But it's really what you do with that information. I think I'm really glad we spent some time in that area of this conversation. It's what you do with that information. It's what you believe you are capable of. And there are a lot of factors that make us different, and honestly, we didn't even get to probably half of them. And I think, but now that some of these things like genetics and sex differences and all of these things that we're so blessed to have Greg on this podcast today to listen to just how passionate he is about all areas of research in strength and conditioning, but to just be able to learn from all of that. But again, not comparing your journey to the chick on social media who's eating 500 grams of carbs a day and looks absolutely shredded, because that's probably the person that we're talking about, that maybe they just are incredibly genetically blessed, and maybe they're able to get on the Olympia stage but only train twice a week. And there are those people, but those are not the norm. And so we look at that bell curve, we look at that 95% 2 standard deviations away from the mean. Those are 95% of the people are going to fall in that normal range. And then of course you're going to have people on those very, very far ends of the spectrum. So I think that's a really good kind of way to tie a bow on that. So we always ask one final question to all of our guests on this podcast, and that would be, Greg, what is your, and of course any other concluding points or things that you want to add to the conversation, but what is your advice to our listener who is just looking to become a better version of themselves and to live a healthier lifestyle?
So I don't really have any points to add to wrap up. I think y'all did a very, very good job with that. A tip for someone looking to live a healthier lifestyle, I would say,
within or outside the context of what we talked about.
Oh, it's definitely going to be outside. I would say an important principle is primarily just to find things you enjoy doing. I think a lot of people wind up falling off the wagon because they've been exposed to information saying that, like, oh, this is the best way to train, or like this is the way you have to exercise in order to be healthy. And like, that's all bullshit. 100%. Like 95% of the benefits you can derive from exercise are derived simply from exercising and not exercising. So yeah, find whatever you like. I think in lifting, a very common thing you'll hear from people is like, oh, like my doctor or like my coach in some sport I played growing up said that like running and jogging is the be all end all. And then I found the iron and I love the iron and it's the best. And I think a lot of people think that that's like 100% generalizable. But like, I know a fair amount of people where the exact opposite has been true. Like maybe they played football growing up and then like they hopped on a bike and went for a long ride one time and they said, fuck the weight room. I actually don't like lifting. I like cycling. And for them, like, hell yeah, keep cycling. That's great. So yeah, like whatever it is you find that keeps you active, that you actually enjoy doing, just do it. Like that's probably what you're going to stick with best. And like for long-term health outcomes, like that's ultimately the name of the game. Find something you like doing that you can do frequently and consistently do it.
Yeah, even if it's not the best thing based on your 23andMe results or what you have grown up believing is right or best for you. It's that sustainability aspect. Do what you
Absolutely.
I love it.
Yeah. So we covered a lot of information in this episode. So we started the episode, Greg, talking about your background in fitness and how you created this blog, because again, it was something that you were super interested in and wanted to talk to more people other than your wife. And now you have the Stronger by Science podcast. You talked about mass. We talked about programming and variations in responses to training and nutrition, talked a lot about genetics, beliefs, and differences between sexes, and then our big topic on practical applications and the takeaways. And I love the last tip that you gave about find something that you enjoy doing rather than trying to focus on what is going to give me the best results. It's now something that is going to be sustainable for you long term. So if people want to find out more about you, they want to listen to your podcast, where can they find you? Where are you on social media?
So you can find the podcast at sbspod.com, or it is just the Stronger by Science podcast, wherever fine and sometimes not so fine podcasts are found. Social media, on Facebook, I'm probably most active in the Stronger by Science Facebook group that's called Stronger by Science Community. Let's see. Also have a subreddit. There's a Stronger by Science subreddit if you're listening to this and you are a Redditor. For just like my personal stuff, I'm probably most active on Instagram. That's just at Greg Nuckols. The actual like fitness and science stuff we post is mostly on the Stronger by Science Instagram account. That's just at Stronger by Science. And free content we put out, articles, strongerbyscience.com.
And then what about mass? If people want to.
So I work on a research review every month with Eric Trexler, Eric Helms, and Mike Sordos. It's called MASS, for Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. We go through the research. We find the stuff that will hopefully be the most useful and relevant to lifters and coaches. And if you want to learn more about that, you can do so at strongerbyscience.com/mass.
Awesome. And I would highly recommend that you guys check out Greg's Instagram. He has a lot of different and really cool recipes. He is quite the little cook. So I would check that out. But do you have anything that you want to add to the episode before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Just thank you all for so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being on. It was a lot of information. It was really cool. Well, we hope that you guys enjoyed this week's episode. If you haven't already, make sure you guys are subscribed to the podcast. You can find Greg on all the social medias that he just listed, and you can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit and Marissa at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.